there is a great revolution coming in the educational processes. There's a great revolution coming in almost all of our pattern of life. When I was born near here in Milton, Massachusetts in 1895, the beginning of an automobile manufacture occurred out west, but we didn't hear anything about it in Milton. And not until I was 7 years old did I see an automobile. When I was 9 years old, the aeroplane was invented. The radio had been invented when I was born, but not until I was around 10 did some of my friends begin to try to make amateur sets, and considerably later we began to have word of the SOS being used at sea. I was born, in other words, well before the present era's mechanization seemed to me quite an unreliable affair, because I used to have to crank and work on them so much so that I never have come into the frame of mind that assumes that all the machinery will work very well. I notice young people today assume that their automobile engine will always respond, and their brakes will always respond, so they drive much closer to one another than my conditioned reflex will allow me to drive. When my daughter was born in 1927, I was pushing her in a baby carriage in Chicago in Lincoln Park, and a little biplane went overhead. Airplanes were still very scarce. That was the year that Lindbergh flew the Atlantic. They were so scarce that it was not until 2 years after I was pushing the baby carriage, this airplane went over, that the night airmail was flown out of Chicago in a biplane, cloth-covered wings. I was amazed then to think of my daughters looking up in the sky from her baby carriage and having an airplane in her sky as what we might call the natural universe as you come into it. My granddaughter was born 12 years ago, and her father and mother took her to a place where they lived in New York, just north of the Harlem River. It's quite a highland area, and they had an apartment on the top third floor of an old wooden house, about the highest point on that piece of land. And it was right in the flight path of the airplanes out of LaGuardia Field and the inbound Continental International, New York International, which we now call Kennedy Airport. Within 1 minute, there was as much as 3 airplanes going overhead, and it was not surprising that my granddaughter's first word was not mommy or daddy, but air. And they would take her to the window and see the planes going overhead. She was born in the fall of the year, and she saw several thousand airplanes before she ever saw a bird. So airplanes were more normal in her sky than birds. And she looked down on the West Side Highway, which went right by, and she saw hundreds of thousands of automobiles before she ever saw any animal other than man. And she was given the children's book that every child was given when I was young. And in the children's book there were pictures of barnyard animals, of cows and chickens and pigs. And she, of course, never seen anything like that. And she would laugh with us at their strange designs. And they were just, I'd like to bring about the realization of the changes that have come about in our environment that we don't tend to think about, and the very fact that everybody thought it was normal to give her the same children's books shows how little the world was really adjusting to the really fundamental changes that are occurring. The fundamental changes that are occurring in our life are essentially almost all invisible. I'd say that well over 99.5% of all the important exploration man is doing today is in the ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum that are completely invisible and non-contacted by our senses. And so that the great changes are invisible. We have not only very limited range of tuning in the electromagnetic spectrum, but we also have very limited range in the motion spectrum, because the motion spectrum combines the individual takes in the electromagnetic spectrum plus the after images and memory, which gives a series of frames on a 60-cycle basis. We can not see the hands of the clock move, but we remember the hands were in another position, and we accredit them moving, as we call it, clockwise. We can't see the stars in motion, though they move well over 1 million miles a day. We do not see the atoms in motion. In fact, we begin to discover what we see in motion is so very limited that we fail to see great changes coming about in our society, which we could see, for instance, a large enough spectrum to see a plant grow. We might be able to also see some of the trends. I find then that world society is lingering in images which were put in books and pictures, and is very, very out of date with what's going on. This means that the revolutions which are about to come upon us are going to come in many ways as very disturbing elements. For instance, I would expect the whole educational system as we know it in terms of schoolhouses and universities and great buildings and so forth, clusters of buildings, and the concept of that you go to the college and you stay in the college, these things are going to change so radically that they will, that will within 10 years will seem like a very strange part of the past that we ever did such things. I've got to make good, if I can, with you on why I think these changes are coming. I am visiting some of the Maori in New Zealand a couple of years ago. I was studying their art forms, and Maori are sea people. 3/4 of the earth is water. The sea is really the more normal part of the earth. There are not many people who really lived in the sea, but they are those people. And their art form, in order to understand it, you have to realize that an island to them is a hole in the ocean. Our pictures are of islands, and we do not take the comprehensive, but they start with the comprehensive, and then the local becomes the reverse. So they look at the shape of the sea going into the land rather than the bay that we look at as an indentation in our land. I want to realize then that I think the changes that are coming about with world society are going to be as severe in orientation as that, because we've tended to look at the particular and be very, very local and not to think in the terms of the comprehensive. We have philosophers doing so. We have the poets trying to make things a little more comprehensive. We used to have what we call the natural philosophers. Alfred North Whitehead was a natural philosopher, and Bridgman was a natural philosopher. Eddington was a natural philosopher. But we've become so specialized in this very short time that we don't have any confidence in the people who try to integrate and try to see the whole. This, in a sense, has been something just more or less reserved for the big businessman. He becomes a comprehensive manager of a number of specialists. But his viewpoint is always also very, not only very specialized, but extraordinarily short-sighted. I don't think it's possible for us to understand how fantastically short-sighted humanity has become. We've come to the point where even those who are thought to be fairly idealistic in political concepts, such as in socialism, say the Soviets and China are all burning up the fossil fuels just as fast as the private enterprises, which means that we're burning up the savings account because it took millions of years to put down that energy and conserve it into the earth. And we have vast amounts of income energy. And they say, well, this fossil fuel, we say the income energy costs a great deal more to harness than just burning up the savings account. So I'd say that I find little altruism or long-distance thought when in the Soviets, who then would participate in burning up. So we suddenly confront a generation, whether it's the next generation or 100 generations today, would say, children, it's up to you to take it. You take it in the nose for our short-sightedness. I even hear people say in a tone of voice as if they think it is reasonable, what did this next generation ever do for us? In other words, I think we're not only very short-sighted today, but we're living in an age of probably the maximum immorality ever demonstrated by humanity. Because we have much greater knowledge than those before us. We ought to be able to see the consequences of our acts, and we have no ability to coordinate ourselves to act in response to the comprehensive integrating information. Now, I would say my whole hope lies in the new world, the new generations. I'm quite sure that one reason humanity loves children so much is that children are actually born perfect. They are designed and born to be a physical and an economic success. But we've mismanaged our world so badly that we've always come out with man being a failure. Only one in a million at the turn of the century would live out his total span and live out his total span in economic success. Being one in a million was assumed he was such a freak that it must be ordained by God that this one would survive, and people tended to then make the kings ordained by God, and people who were such kings couldn't understand it themselves, so they assumed it must be the will of God. I feel great hope, however, in the terms of the younger life, provided we can really give them the right environment controls, and everything about this life that's born perfect, whether it can ever succeed in taking command and taking the initiative in relation to life depends apparently entirely on the environment. We now know a great deal about the behavioral sciences. It is not popularly realized that our national defense appraising the situation regarding health and its effect on the nation took great cognizance of the fact that in World War II the number one highest casualty was the mental case. They'd thought for a while that it was just as a moment aberration in history, but it began to find it was increasing after World War II rather than decreasing, to the point where they suddenly realized that some very large amounts of money must be spent on really learning something about the subconscious behaviors. The men who'd come after Freud had no benefit of large research funds, and so it's been an individual strategy of the little individual trying to find out something about the subconscious, but not learning too much. No correlation of it with the physiological things. Everything thought to be just between the man and his consciousness and his subconsciousness, not including the environment to an important degree, paying attention to parents to some extent. The behavioral sciences then in Washington have now been given billions are necessary. And at the Walter Reed Hospital, about 4 years ago, they initiated an entirely new exploration into behaviors of all creatures and correlation of all the behaviors of all creatures with finding what the controls, what the drives may be, and correlating all the way up to the human being. And the exploration is not just in the observed behaviors, but in physiological, studying all the chemical inputs, outputs, a complete documentation of all the environmental conditions that obtained throughout the whole life. Every type of creature is in research in Washington. The laboratories you would find in the Walter Reed Hospital, go there, are fantastically well organized, and there are a great many of them outside the Walter Reed Hospital and other parts of Bethesda and Washington complex. What we have to do with each of the lives is to find out first the patternings of the drives that regenerate that life, and have to learn how to intercept them in a way in which the creature will not suffer, but you'll use his drive to discover what are the cognitions of that life. For instance, we want to know about a frog, and a frog is difficult to deal with as far as intercepting his food because he likes to leap for his food. But frogs submerge in water for long periods of time, and they must have air, however, every so often. And they then put the frog in the tank completely filled with water, and on top of it there's a glass plate. And frogs are used to coming up under lily pads and to get their air and look around, see if it's safe to come out, see what they do next. So they have on top of the glass plate several opaque objects, quite a few of them. And the frog has to find which one of those he can push up, and only one can he push up to get his air. So at first all he has to do is to push it away. He allows himself quite a safety margin between when he first, just reflexively goes to get his air and when he might really be in trouble. And one of the things we've learned in the total pattern of all the creature studies in Washington is that you must not penalize them. To penalize them or punish them is to go beyond the tolerable limits. And there are a great deal of cushioning in our lives where you can get a little thin, and that's a good warning for quite some time that you might be getting into trouble if we're starving you a little too much. There's this critical range, and there's a tolerable range. It's been learned in their total patterning in Washington that what we would call punishment would be to do things within a tolerable range. You don't expect to kill life in punishing it. But it is a punishment when you give them delay that's getting close to the critical. Punishing makes all the life become panicky, and from there on you can't learn anything about their cognitions. It's been discovered that what you must do is to give them rewards. And the rewards are not they're not extra superficial to their life. They're not a silver cup, they're not a sweet as a dessert. But the reward is getting what they need very early within the tolerable range, so that they become really subconsciously advantaged by getting what it is they need. That is, you're sitting there now and breathing, and you don't realize you're breathing. If I were to prevent you from having air and you become very conscious of it, you'd get to quite a panicky state if I might getting you too near the edge of the critical side of this tolerable zone. Then you'd become very conscious of your breathing. We are unconscious of our eye until we get a speck in them. We're unconscious of our tongue until we bite it. It's extraordinary how well coordinated we are on a subconscious basis with most of our apparatus. So that I find then that the what we call the rewards is letting you have what you need. You're the creature within the earliest phase, so that you inhibit it subconsciously. And therefore, you're not aware of what you're really disclosing to me. Now, the frog, having found which is the dark object at the top of his water, which he pushes to get his air, they leave it there for quite a few days. Then they give it a color, say red, and they move the one which is going to get there, and he'll keep it red. And you observe whether he goes, tries them all out and just finds a new one by spot chance, or whether he goes after the red, and you find that he goes after the red directly. So you know that he has cognition within our electromagnetic spectrum range, at least to the red. And you try out all the spectrum range, you find he recognizes all the colors you and I recognize. Then you try, as a guide, you make it triangular, and where it had been circular before. And he follows the triangle. And so you find that he recognizes the geometries that you do. One way or another, we begin to find out what all the different creatures recognize, and by virtue of which the strategies of their brains would operate. And it comes out really very surprising to discover how many of the creatures are tuned in where we as human beings are tuned in. Now, I've seen this behavioral science work then going from this very simplest creatures up to complex ones such as the chimpanzees. The chimps are very, very bright. The orangutans are apparently the brightest. They have the largest range of cognitions and quite brilliant reflexing and coordination. There are two chimpanzees, quite young, and they were doing, I think they were just a little over a year old, and they were doing 4.5 hours of binary mathematics a day to get their food. And in every one of these creatures, the experiment is organized as it now can be by virtue of the billions of dollars available, not in such a manner that the scientist stands there and makes chance observations, but everything is instrumented. There's enormous control panels, and we know all the environmental conditions. We know the temperatures of the water, of course, the amount of light, and what kind of light, or even what part of the spectrum range of light is coming upon them. We know all the chemical input and the chemical output of the creature itself. We follow the weight of the creature itself is readable on the control card at all times. If you're cutting down his weight, this way you watch his critical range, that you mustn't be starving him. You prefer really to work with the young ones at first, because then you know what the growth curve is, and you're sure that you're not breaking away from it. So what the scientists are doing is designing new patterns for alteration to discover the cognitions, and they must be sure not to make it such a jump that they're starving their life or getting out of that critical range. Now we get to the point where I'll talk about those chimps first. The two chimps that I was looking at who could do the binary mathematics, the scientist went around, looked at the card, and he said one of them is going to go through his routine now, because they're getting close to, this one hasn't had his food. But both of them were swinging on a swing in quite a large cage, having fun. And saying fun, all the creatures having learned that you can't ever punish, you can only reward, it is a positive atmosphere. And they, as I went from room to room, different creatures, there were all these eyes, and their eyes looking at you as you come in the room. And they are really apparently enjoying the variation of life. They're saying what's coming next, because they aren't being punished, and there is really a very strong kind of rapport that goes on between the scientists and the eyes of these creatures. These two chimps looked at me, apparently with pleasure. They were showing off to me the things they could do in the swing. And they said one of them was going to go through the routine. Within a minute he started off, and he went over to the edge of the room, and there was a little telephone set that he started dialing. As he dialed certain points, then the lights would go on, then dial some more, and some bells went off. And finally he dialed some more, and over in the corner of his room was kind of Alcatraz prison. And the door swung open, he went in, closed the door, and he got food, and he went over in the corner and started dialing some more. And the scientist said, the routine path he's going through here now has been through so many times, become really so subconscious that he'd be free to look at you. And he said that he enjoys being applauded and appreciated in what he's doing, so get his attention now. So I clapped on, and he turned around, he was dialing, but not looking where he was dialing at all, looking at me and enjoying my applause. This is typical of the thing, of the investigation. We get to the point where they have electrodes on the heads of a great many rhesus monkeys and chimps, and they'll learn to wear an electrode on the head as well, and the human being learns to wear a hat, and it doesn't bother them at all. But we go through the correlation of what's going on in the brain through the electrodes and the other behavior patterns, and therefore they're being monitored day and night. And you see a little chimp sitting, they're sitting on stools, and they're getting the chemistry going out as well as what's going in. After these creatures get to the point where they die, then they slice them up and identify all the tissue that's been indicated in the patternings with the electrode probings and so forth. Getting to the point now where there's complete chemical and genetic and brain behavior patterning being correlated to the point where you really know something. Now, I'll tell you something that strikes me as extraordinarily important regarding the discoveries of the neurologists who are dealing with the man brain and the physiologists who are doing the electrode probing of the human brains. These leading men say it is easier to explain all the data they have regarding this extraordinary apparatus if they assume a phenomena mind as well as a phenomena brain than it is to explain all the data if they assume only brain. They point out that the brain is in effect a very complex telephone system where the numbers of neurons or the stations, the telephone sets are up somewhere around 1 billion times 1 billion. And in this telephone system, you have the answering services and the message recording services and so forth. But it is a very extraordinary system in that it has then video as well as smello and toucho and so forth. There are extraordinary television sets which have the smello and the toucho and all these pictures coming in the brain with all the different sense contacts, readings. And there are call-up sets and recall sets and present information coming in and projection sets and so forth. The reason they say what they do about mind and brain is that there are conversations that go over the wires that cannot be explained as feedback of the system. And I've now formulated a way of making clear what the difference between the mind and the brain is, and the neurologists, very top men who I've talked to, feel that what I say is reasonable, though that, as I said, certainly it's too short a time to say, we say you are right, and this is all there is to it. I say what you're saying seems to be correct, although it may not be all there is to it. I'm not afraid of misleading anybody today by saying what I'm saying. Point out that I'll say to you, let me take a piece of rope, and I'm going to pull this piece of rope with my two hands very, very hard, and as I do, the girth begins to contract. As a rope pulled very hard, contracts. Therefore, the rope goes into compression at 90 degrees to the axis of my tensing. So compression is a resultant of the tensing. I take a compression member, like a cigar-shaped compression member, and I load it at the top. As I load it at the top in compression, its girth tries to expand, therefore its girth goes into tension at 90 degrees to the compression loading. We discover experimentally that tension and compression always and only coexist, though tension and compression are really quite, though they're complementary to one another, are not mirror images of one another in their individual unique behaviors, but they always coexist. We find that there's something I speak about, I'd call a system. A system is a first subdivision of the universe. It divides all the universe into two parts. All the universe is outside the system, and all the part of the universe inside the system. So you are a system, and this house is a system, and the earth is a system. You can have big and little systems, but we know that's what it means. How we identify these objects. Cause it's what is outside, what's inside. It is a characteristic of the inside of systems that they're concave. It's a characteristic of the outside of systems that they're convex. You can see it in the egg, which is highly formalized. Convex and concave always and only coexist. In and out always and only coexist. There are a great many always and only coexisting. That is all, and the nuclear particles have their always and only coexisting opposites. So the positron and electron, for instance. Now, then we go a little further and we say we discover all the class of the always and only coexisting behaviors, and we develop something we call the theory of functions. And the word function implies other functions. A function does not exist by itself. And then we get a little further than that in the science. We'll come to the single word, relativity. Now, what I've done here, I said to you, I take a piece of rope, and I've said it to many audiences, and nobody ever says you didn't take a piece of rope. I've generalized. I didn't say whether it's manila or cotton or nylon. I didn't say how long it was, or what its diameter was, or how old it was. I was able to say I can take a piece of rope, and everybody's had so many experiences with ropes and tensing. There was no hesitancy on the part of people to let me generalize the point of saying I take a piece of rope and tense it. That's called a first-degree generalization. It's a second-degree generalization to observe the always and only coexisting tension and the always and only coexisting concavity, etc. It's a third-degree generalization to develop a theory of functions. It's a fourth-degree generalization to say a word like relativity. I say that to you that we have a little dog, and the little dog will play a game with you with a belt or a stocking or whatever you want, and he'll tense it and pull it very hard, trying to pull it away from you. And he then coordinates himself in compression and tension with his teeth, and the thing he's pulling, he coordinates concave and convexity, just the terminals of his teeth themselves. But it is unthinkable to our experience. There's nothing indicated in any of the behavioral science that I've talked to you about that indicates the little dog would develop a third-degree generalization of the theory of functions. The difference then, I'm quite confident, between mind and brain is the ability to generalize. That the brain always deals with special cases. And is the ability of the human mind then to discover principles which are operative in all cases. Because in science, when we say generalization, we mean it holds true in all cases. Literary people use the word generalization as meaning you're just covering too much territory just a little too thinly. You're too general. But in science, it means a principle, discovery of a principle which is operative in all special cases. So I find this very exciting to discover something that is really unique to the mind, which gives us quite a lot of clue about other things. I'm going to now talk about some of the things we know about children in the behavioral sciences. We have a great deal of behavioral science information regarding children. There is a man named Dr. Bloom, Benjamin Bloom of Chicago University. He's head of the Department of Education. He's head of their curricular committee. He's written a number of books, but there's one book in particular called Stability and Change in Human Characteristics, which many people should read. And it contains the case histories of an adequate number of human beings from birth to 26 years of age, with a series of tests which are given to them periodically through all those years, and enough data about the environment of each of these case histories, all of which is so filled in such an orderly manner in respect to each case that any scientist reading is quite satisfied that he has demonstrated what seems to emerge as some very important patterns. The environment conditions include the human beings as well as the seemingly inanimate objects in the environment. And you have to know what the income of the family was at each year when they were born, so forth, what kind of a house they lived in, did they have a bathroom, did the parents drink, etc. What were the important items that happened in the years. Dr. Bloom himself, I find one of the most fascinating men I've ever met, and he made it clear to me that if I could give him items for the first 17 years, items which would take me about 20 minutes to tell him regarding a life that I happen to know about, he can tell you within 1 point what the IQ is at 17 from the environmental conditions. That the environment controls life to that extent is fantastically important new information for us. Benjamin Bloom's book, then, must be correlated with a great neurologist who points out that behaviors of the child from birth are, in fact, along with their actual forming in the womb, they're coordinated as controls become in genetically, as we know, pattern-wise. But the genetic ticker tape controls the moment where, as the brain is finally formed, that the brain will command various coordinations, the use of the information. It apprehends information and it employs it. That is, children begin to speak or they stand up to walk only as the ticker tape sets off the alarm clock within the brain to make them do it. Human beings have thought through the ages that they had to teach their children to walk and to talk. The ticker tapes make the alarm clocks go off at very disparate rates. So one child's alarm clock to walk may not occur for 2 years in relation to another child's. There's sometimes as much as a 3 and 4 year span in the speech, in the initiating of speech. Parents have often thought they had a very dull one. The neighbors remind them they must be rather a dull child, and they work very hard trying to make them stand up and making them talk. This is part of the general thought pattern of humanity, that it had to teach its children that children were little empty milk bottles, or very lovely little milk bottles, but they had to pour all their wisdom and experience into that child. And what we learn now is that parents never teach children anything. In fact, we've learned that nobody teaches anybody anything, that the life teaches itself entirely. The capability to teach is entirely within the brain and the individual himself, and he disciplines himself. What the human beings can do is, once the child is caught onto a principle, got its generalized principle concept, it then can add to its experience the other person's experience. As, for instance, a child in a house in the city, maybe a 2-story house, would learn to slide down the banister, and then that same child may slip on ice in his front doorstep. That child can look at a moving picture of people skiing in the Alps, and they've never been out of the city, and they can now accredit the sliding down. They understand then the sliding, angular slide. In fact, the child starts himself. Very often they've fallen out of bed when they're trying to roll around the bed. Then they've learned very quickly how to angle themselves down over the edge of the bed at such an angle they can valve themselves with the friction on the bed to let gravity pull them a little more, and they throw the head a little further forward, which stops it. So they've learned what we call angular valving of gravity. They don't call it that as a child, but that's just what they're doing superbly. So that I say the child must get its own basic experience. It must start its own coordination, and then parents and elders can give them extensions of the principle so that they will accredit that skiing the Alps. Now, we know that by experiment, cases such as Bloom's book disclose that by 4 years of age, 50% of the total capability to apprehend and coordinate and employ pattern information has been brought into play. At 7 years old, 80% of the total capacity to apprehend and comprehend and coordinate has been brought into play. At 13 years of age, 92% has been brought into play. Between 13 and 17, for the next 4 years, the last 8% comes in. At 17, you have all that you're ever going to have. It is at 17 and on that the federal government puts up $4 and $5 billion a year for education after the horse is gone from the barn. And no money being put up at the place where they're getting the great 50% load, which is 0 to 4 years age. We now know and are able to classify the most prominent factors affecting this child as the various capabilities come in. And we find that the capabilities, as they come in, must be used. If they become unused, they tend to develop some, we just use a word like adhesion, people think about something that becomes unused. They become approximately unemployable. There are many reasons why a child becomes frustrated and shuts off that capability. It seems every time it uses it, seems to get punished for it, so it shuts it off. This is part of that panic pattern that I gave you and of the earlier experimentation. In the little child up to 4, there are 3 most prominent factors are now known to control whether they will continue to employ the capabilities that come in or whether they will shut them off. The 3 most important ones relate to, there's one more important than the other 2. The number 1 of all is trust, because the human child is born utterly helpless and stays utterly helpless longer than the young of any other living species. And part of the invention, utter helplessness, is that there is a dependable at looking out for, and so that child lying in his crib, unable to he can roll around, not knowing the words too well, does have a great sensitivity about tones of voice of those who are looking out for it. If the child hears his parents in a drunken brawl and mother is going to leave home, you have a certified dropout on your hands if that happened the first year. The next 2 most important kinds of patterns in the first 4 years, one is autonomy and the other is initiative. The autonomy relates to the fact that every living creature has a certain amount of space that it's actually going to have to just stretch its own limbs. Human beings breathe 54 pounds of air a day, out of which they extract 7 pounds of oxygen. You have to have plenty of room then for the air that's yours. In other words, there is a ecological sweep out, as the biologists said, of each individual. Each individual guards a certain amount of territory. If you put 3 or 4 children into the same bed, they're not, and they don't. It's a very small room, not enough air. Their IQ will go right down. This capability, I'll refer now to these capability to apprehend, comprehend, and coordinate as IQ for them, because that's the way they use it in the book. If you give them their own bed, their IQ shows that capabilities that come in are not lost. If you give them their own bed in their own room, they prosper the most. That's the autonomy part, and it's typical. There are many other aspects which you could yourself figure out. The initiative relates to the fact that every young child is gradually coordinating more and more of its faculties, its endowments, and it must make experiment after experiment. And you see a child continually pushing something off the table and dropping the floor, and say, why doesn't that mother spank that child for being so annoying, continually knocking those things on the floor? The child has to learn about gravity, and people say, how many times do they have to poke that thing off the table to learn about gravity, or to learn it the first time? That is not true. There are many observations to be made about how you valve gravity, as I said, from just a child learning to valve itself angularly down off the bed, off of chairs. They have very great sensitivity about that, and they use it in the climbing of trees and things. Gravity is something very unique to bodies in the heavens, and the heavenly bodies are very remote from one another. Our own sun being 92 million miles away, and the brightest star in the sky is 4.5 million light years away. So gravity, powerful gravity, or being pulled in towards one of these heavenly bodies, is a very unique matter. You have to be quite near one of them before it begins to take over. I'd say through the universe there's approximately no gravity to be felt. So that I say gravity is a very special kind of condition, and for this life to be experimenting with that gravity as a very special kind of condition is very logical. The child has to tear things apart to find out how things cohere in order to, when it's going to be in danger, know what you grab a hold of this thing or that thing in order to save yourself. They feel that right from the beginning, falling out of their bed. They pull, what can you hold on to? So they're going to tear. They're not interested for very long in newspapers. They find they're very uncohesive. So they will go into library books and find a very good vellum and try that, and they will try to pull the silk dress apart, whatever it is. Each child is in a laboratory which is extremely busy and has a great deal of work to do before it's going to be really successful and use all those coordinating capabilities. It is possible to design environments in such a way that the child doesn't get frustrated by the environment. That is, the child mustn't have to pull on a lamp with a cord and suddenly hits it in the head or gets shocked from an electric socket. It ought to be able to get all of its gravitational experiments and its tension experiments without getting hurt. If the behavioral sciences saw what the full gamut of all those kind of experiments would be, and it's perfectly possible to design environments so children get all of those coordinations and those pursue their initiative without getting frustrated. Parents themselves frustrate the children a very great deal by their fears, and they say, don't, and you're going to get hurt this way, and don't, this and that. Now, stopping up that experimentation is, again, one of the ways in which the coordinating components in the brain, one way it tends to get shut off. There's nothing that I say that must indicate to you that the shutting off of capabilities means that they are irreparably shut off. The individual himself in great duress and emergency someday may find it necessary to take a hold of these things. He has intuition that is still in there and he will pull them out. But it is an exceptional case that the individual recovers these capabilities. We know it can be done, but there's nothing anybody from outside can do to help that person get hold of those capabilities and get them opened up again. Now, in the age 4 to 7, by far the most prominent pattern is the speech pattern of the parents in the terms of the actual words which are now being recognized. If the parents are clearly attempting to understand what it is they're experiencing and are trying to formulate their own words and look up the words and get better tools of expression, the child can feel this earnest struggle to apprehend and comprehend and to deal. If the parents are using cliches, if they're just accepting the dictum of the nearest saloon as to what they should think about things, they're giving up the use of their own brain and then reverting just to muscle and cunning. The children feel so too. How the parents' behavior is fantastic in its effect on the child. There are about 7 items that have now been identified in the age 4 to 7, where you're bringing in the next 30%. But they relate primarily to this articulation, the use of the brain to deal competently in the individual's own right with the circumstances. The smells of books are the right kind of books. The children may not understand those books at all, but they can get a feel of whether just the way they're handled, the way they're left on the table, where the parents are really making that attempt. That's enough to tell you about factors to can comprehend that we have great identification today with the factors that spell out, as Benjamin Bloom then shows, what the environmental effects are going to be on the individual to the point where he's able to identify the actual behavior of that individual and give you that IQ within one point. Now I'm going to go to a little bigger pattern. I would say that I myself became interested in all of this because in 1922 our first child died just before her 4th birthday. She'd caught the flu and then spinal meningitis and infantile paralysis in World War I. I was in the Navy, and in the regular Navy, I'd been in the Naval Academy Special Course and started Harvard. And I felt that the environmental conditions under which we had to live, both the very low pay and the just poor quarters that were available and the little that man knew about things, I felt that these things were picked up in the environment, and I felt that if society had applied the same kind of capital advantage to the exploration of how to make man a success as he'd put into how to make my battleship and my airplane and develop the great weaponry, that this probably would not have happened. And it is true then, within the great medical, the enormous amounts of money given to medicine have come through the enormous undertakings to deal with war, and a great deal of it was to get men who you'd trained back on the front. Since the time my child died, the spinal meningitis and infantile paralysis all been put under control. But we thought at that time that nobody knew anything about how to help. They were thought to be always fatal. Now, our little first child, with 2 trained nurses most of her life, demonstrate laws of compensation, but her little mind was not affected, and she burned very brightly to such an extent that I became convinced that young life has very much more than the older life had been accrediting it with. She had all the loving a child could possibly have. And so many things were revealed. And this set me to work when my second child was born in 1927, 5 years after our first child died, 9 years after the birth of the first child. I decided to reorganize my whole life. I said, I'm not going to try to make money and look out for this new child directly. There's some normal, logical things you're going to do, but I'm not going to try to be an economic success just to take care of her, because I think if she's going to be as fine a child as a child could be, and I'm quite sure all children have something very extraordinary, that she would respond. If I spent the rest of my time working on ways in which young life could prosper, all young life could prosper, if I could make the world actually a little more satisfactory, more promising, then rather than just finding special advantage for this child when she grows up, finding herself a special advantage in the rest of world society in great disadvantage, if she's the kind of child I'd like her to be, she ought to be very unhappy. And if she's the kind of child I think she could be in the potential of children, that if I really commit myself to working on the environment for all life, to give all the young life a chance, then I think she may come into her own majority at a time when some of the chances for successful survival of life may be greater. I was convinced by just my own experiences as a little child with other children going to their homes, and when I heard them being scolded by the parents, where I knew the circumstances, I knew that they were not actually, had not been naughty, and they were being treated as if they were naughty. And I realized that parents and the mother worried about the rent, worried about many things that the young one do not know, and at the end of the day working very hard, just to the point where her nerves were worn, and she didn't mean to blow up, but she just blew off at the nearest child. But I said, I see that I must then make the life grudge-proof for the elders in order for them not to reflex and frustrate their own children as a consequence of inadequate environment in which they're having to live. So that I saw this eventually came out what I call the Dymaxion house, which I worked out every way I knew to meet these kind of conditions, to do it in such a way that life could well afford it, and the resources of the earth are being used in such an economical and efficient manner that there would be enough for all. Those are the conditions I felt were necessary. I had decided in 1927 that there were two things you could do if you wanted to improve the total existence of man on earth. One, you could try to reform the man himself, and the other, you could reform the environment. And the environment, if properly reformed, would allow man to really behave well. I said, I don't think I can improve on man. He's quite an extraordinary piece of design. He simply has been spoiled. Rather than, it's not something you improve, it's something you preserve the very high potential to which he's born. So that I can do best in the environment. So I made up my mind in 1927 to forever eschew any reform of my fellow man and commit myself entirely to altering the environment. The environment is always being altered. There's a very famous geneticist, he's an animal geneticist, Dr. Waddington at the University of Edinburgh, and he talks about what he calls the epigenetic landscape. The epigenetic landscape is the effect on the landscape. The landscape is always being altered by not only life, but by the inanimates, by the winds and erosion, gravity, radiation of the sun. But the animals, all the life, biological life, is continually altering that environment. Once the environment is altered, the altered environment alters the life, and there's regeneration back and forth. In fact, the really big power drive of evolution exists in the relationship of the innate genetics and the epigenetic landscape. So this again would be another way of talking about the effect of the environment on life. Now, I would certainly say then that I have learned by experimental exploration that it is possible to bring about an environment in which the new life can prosper. In fact, that is one of the things that has been going on in an important degree, so that the new life that has been born in the interim years between 1927 and now has a very different set of circumstances. We had last year at Berkeley a demonstration of a large group of young humanity demonstrating a very great discontent with the circumstances of which they found themselves in, and even what we thought it was probably better kind of environment, a great educational institution. Now I've discovered that it is the great environmental evolution that has occurred just in my own lifetime that I mentioned at the beginning, that is bringing about a very different set of behaviors of our new life. I would call your attention to the behavior of the students at Berkeley last January, a year ago, which these young students demonstrated a very great fundamental discontent with the older life, even under the very favorable circumstances of a great university. The reporters who interrogated those students found that they were predominantly in the junior year, which means that the same group are now the seniors at the universities around the world. They also found that these thoughts and demonstrations of the Berkeley students, which it had been surmised first might not have occurred at Stanford, where the students were much richer. The reporters found that was not true, that the Stanford students felt the same way. The reporters went up and down the coast of California and found the students at all the universities had the same general attitudes. They had no special sense of loyalty either to their family or to their locality or to the university or even to the country, the nation. They had considerable affection for their parents and for other people, but the word loyalty did not seem to be applicable to the way they felt. This seemed to be shocking to society they read about, because they're used to the ideas of human beings demonstrating very great loyalties. And my own life has been involved with many, many universities and colleges, and still is. I've already visited in my lifetime 175 universities around the world, and some of them I visit frequently, as for instance, I've been to Princeton since 1929 almost every other year, and I've spent 8 years at MIT. I only go, incidentally, to universities and colleges who invite me. I don't have any managers and I don't do any promotion. In fact, it's one of my fundamental self-disciplines that I'll never talk, except when I'm asked to talk, that I will not talk about anything until I've carried an experiment, an idea into some technical invention, and I won't talk about that invention until I'm sure that it works. And then again, I must not spend any of my time going around trying to ask anybody to listen to me, because I wouldn't have any time to do any really important research if I did, because the people who you have to ask to listen to you are not interested. And it is quite efficient when you wait for the people to ask you to speak to them. Now, because I do visit many universities and been visiting a lot of universities since the Berkeley incident last year, and my visits are now actually around the world to the extent that I'm apparently going around the world about every 9 months. I have the opportunity at universities to work with students, and they give me the opportunity to choose which students I would like to work with. Because of the Berkeley incident, I decided to always ask to work with that age group. And I've talked to the students, not only the students at Berkeley who took part in that, but with the students of the same age at universities all around the world. That's in Africa, Australia, Hong Kong, Europe, England, and so forth in this last year. I can now say something to you about the lives of that particular age group and regarding the environmental conditions, because I've interrogated them regarding their environments. Number one to be observed is that the seniors this year were born in the year of Hiroshima. No matter how much they love their parents, how much love the parents may have shown towards them, they say the world of my parents and its society that allowed a general bombing and destruction of humanity wholesale that were non-combatants. Therefore, there's something wrong with the organization of my parents' world. Therefore, I don't trust it. I can't take it for granted that they are as responsible as they would like to be. I can't take their counsel and their wisdom if they could not control conditions any better than that.